With this video, we are beginning a new series, which is on the work entitled Introduction to Metaphysics by Martin Heidegger. And we will be reading this in the translation by Fried and Polt, revised and expanded, second edition. Martin Heidegger was a seminal figure in 20th century continental philosophy, arguably the most important philosopher of the last century. By practically universal consensus, he's simultaneously one of the most controversial and one of the most original thinkers in the whole history of philosophy. Like most 20th century philosophers, he was an academic by occupation and a famous teacher of other famous philosophers like Hans-Georg Gadamer and Hannah Arendt. But his influence went far beyond this, influencing most of the major continental European philosophers ever since, as well as a healthy portion of philosophers in other areas of the world, such as East Asia and the Americas. He was very much a 20th century German, whose life was unfortunately wrapped up in the tumult of his time and place. This work, Introduction to Metaphysics, was originally presented as a set of lectures, a lecture course at the University of Freiburg in southwest Germany in the summer of 1935. Of course, this was 5 or so years into Hitler's Third Reich, and so it's marked by that historical context, which has raised a lot of issues for some people. We will largely sidestep those issues in this course. Heidegger himself apparently thought of this lecture as a suitable entree into his thought because in 1953, he selected it as the first of his many written-out lecture courses to release for publication. So what is it about Heidegger's Introduction to Metaphysics that makes it a work worth studying in a general survey of Western metaphysics? Well, in this work, Heidegger challenges the dominant assumptions of metaphysics, going all the way back to Plato. He was a famously critical, even radically critical thinker, and in fact a critic of the entire tradition since Plato. One first stab at characterizing Heidegger's issue with metaphysics since Plato is given by the title to the longest chapter of the work, which is entitled The Restriction of Being. The Restriction of Being. In other words, metaphysics since Plato has had a tendency to restrict being in a deleterious way, and a concomitant tendency to forget, or as we might say, overlook, certain manifestations, aspects, or dimensions of being. One fundamental flaw of Western metaphysics from Heidegger's perspective is a dualistic tendency in Platonism. So, very quickly, a typical Platonizing move that I have in mind here is to set up a radical exclusionary opposition, primarily between being and something opposed to and excluding being, such as being versus the nothing or nothingness, or being versus becoming, or reality versus appearance, or facts versus values, etc. And we might also mention in this connection other secondary dualisms, such as that between the universal and the particular, between the transcendent form and the immanent sensible particular, between form and matter, between substance and accident, between actuality and potentiality, between cause and effect, between essence and existence, between the eternal and the temporal, between finite and infinite, or between the infinite or infinity and the finite or finitude, between the mind and the body, between thought and extension, between action and passion. And there are many more dualities that could be added to this list, but already this list makes pretty clear that the Western mind is traditionally a dualistic mind. So that's the first what I'm calling a Platonizing move that began with Plato and carried out through the history of Western metaphysics to set up this kind of radical exclusionary opposition, this dualism. The second Platonizing move, once a dualistic opposition is set up in this way, is to privilege one term of the opposition and to subordinate or exclude the other term. So in Western metaphysics, there's a traditional emphasis on the privileging of, just to continue with the list I gave a minute ago, the privileging of being, form, the universal, substance, cause, reality, factuality, actuality, essence, infinity, eternity, mind, the ideal, action, and so on. The privileging of those things, and then the exclusion or subordination of the contrary term of the opposition. So the subordination or exclusion of nothingness, becoming, appearance, values, potentiality, effects, passions, concrete existence, the temporal, the finite. We could add many more examples like this. So those are the two moves. First, a Platonizing move to set up a radical dualistic opposition between two aspects of being and something else, and then to privilege one term of the opposition as true being, and then the other is either subordinate or derivative or secondary in some way. What's the problem that Heidegger sees with these familiar Platonizing moves? The answer is that if metaphysics or philosophy begins as a questioning of being, i.e., if it begins with the question, what is being, then the Platonizing answers, according to Heidegger, serve to conceal, to obscure, to hide being from our gaze, and also to conceal, obscure, and hide the possibilities of meaning that being contains. So this Platonizing marginalization, as we might call it, to use a fashionable contemporary term, serves to occlude the distinctive kind of being that the subordinate terms in these oppositions have. They become things that the philosopher is not supposed to concern himself with anymore. Now, this Platonizing move has become so reflexive in Western metaphysics before Heidegger that the early 20th century philosopher Alfred North Whitehead famously called all of Western philosophy mere footnotes to Plato. Heidegger, therefore, sometimes styles himself as a radical critic of metaphysics or even philosophy itself, which is a stance that has become increasingly popular position in philosophy since Hume and Kant. And it's the characteristic stance of self-styled, scientifically oriented, and I put those in air quotes, scientifically oriented, which actually are scientistic philosophical movements. Often they don't recognize themselves to be philosophical movements. The most historically influential of which is logical positivism. But Marxist philosophers of a certain stripe and psychoanalysts of a certain stripe could also be included under this rubric, but in a different vein. They want to unmask metaphysics, to show that it's really bunk, a rationalization of false consciousness or a neurotic symptom or something like that. And they are a continuation, in the sense, of the radical enlightenment of the 18th century. But unlike the scientistic or the debunking critiques of metaphysics and philosophy, Heidegger wants to critique metaphysics in order to recover the fundamental attitude of questioning that gave rise to metaphysics in the first place. And in this respect, he's closer to Kant, say, than to Hume or Marx or Freud. He wants to start over, in a sense. He wants a redo of Western philosophy without Plato's missteps. Or maybe it's wrong to call these simply missteps. Maybe it's rather a path that we were fated to travel, but that now has reached a dead end, compelling us to retrace our steps. Heidegger will call this another inception in his work. Now, as these remarks suggest, there's a strongly historical dimension to Heidegger's philosophy. For him, we need to appreciate how philosophy is intertwined with history. And incidentally, this is one of the reasons I proceeded historically through metaphysics in this series of video lectures. The most difficult part of Heidegger is found in the manner in which he approaches history. The typical historian of philosophy will strive to dispel the strangeness of the past and to make the unfamiliarity of the past into something familiar, similar to something contemporary. For example, he'll try to restate the terminology of the ancient philosopher in a contemporary terminology. Heidegger is one of the most difficult of all philosophers because his goal is something like the opposite of the historian of philosophy. When he reads texts of the tradition, and here we will be concerned especially with pre-Socratic texts, he assumes some familiarity of the reader with these texts, that he is assuming an educated reader in that sense, someone who's got a basic philosophical education. And what he wants to do is defamiliarize them, so to speak, to undo their miseducation, if you will. Now, it's probably too strong, but he certainly wants to defamiliarize them, to make them seem strange and weird to us. And of course, this is akin to making them incomprehensible, but that's not his goal either. Rather, his goal is to set us free from our prejudices and our unthinking responses to these texts, and to see them with a fresh pair of eyes. As a reader of the tradition, Heidegger aims to undercut and go deeper than what we might call the mere historian of philosophy. He's doing a kind of super history of philosophy that attempts to plumb the depths in a way that the mere historian doesn't do, who's merely doing scholarship, as Heidegger might say. Heidegger is doing history, or he takes himself to be doing history, but of a more fundamental and essential sort of history than the conventional historian. At least that's how he sees it. One result of Heideggerian reappropriation of the thought of the past is to teach us a new vocabulary, not a new technical philosophical jargon, say like the scholastics or like Spinoza, but a new world-disclosing language. In this, he is kindred to a great poet. A great poet, at least in the modern era, is difficult to read, not immediately intelligible. A great poet uses language to bring things into focus that we overlooked before. If you live, for example, in a historical city or by a noteworthy natural monument of some kind, you may have walked past it every day for a number of years without really seeing what the poet has seen there, and then you read the poem and it discloses itself. That's what I mean by world disclosing language. All of a sudden, a gestalt switch occurs and you see it, as it were, for the first time with fresh eyes. That's the idea. Also, a great poet will draw our attention to language itself, to the opacity of language rather than its usual everyday transparency. Ordinarily, we don't dwell on the words, on the texture of words, on the uniqueness of the letters and so on. We see through the words into the subject matter itself. But a great poet often will draw our attention to language itself. So Heidegger's style of philosophy thus cuts two ways. First of all, it gets us to see something in the phenomena of being themselves that we didn't see before in those phenomena. And second, it gets us to see how the familiar, even the sometimes hackneyed language of the philosophical tradition, for example, the language of substance, attribute, accident, form, matter, essence, and so on, it gets us to see how this language is not as natural and inevitable as it makes itself out to be, or as it has come to seem to someone who is educated in the tradition, used to using this language. Rather, it maybe for our contemporary purposes, a good example would be something like the language of the mind, or the language of subjectivity and objectivity, right? Which seems natural to us and almost inevitable language. But a philosopher of Heidegger's stripe will get us to see how it's not natural and inevitable, how certain choices have been made, and how certain phenomena are disclosed by that familiar language, while others are occluded or veiled over. So it's not as natural and inevitable as those who have unthinkingly imbibed the traditional lingo and used it for years as a matter of reflex have been accustomed to think. And I think actually this is one of Heidegger's greatest achievements, to have done this, to have bequeathed to philosophy a new way of speaking and seeing. However, this is also a feature of Heidegger's discourse that makes him controversial. If you've been trained to think of metaphysics as a science with a settled paradigm, one that has its own established professional technical vocabulary like any other science, and this is a fair description of, say, someone who's been brought up and trained in the scholastic tradition or in analytic philosophy and so on. If you're that type of trained philosopher, you will likely be put off by Heidegger's language. You might even dismiss it as mere poetry, if not gibberish, and thus refuse to regard it as talking about metaphysical questions altogether. You might even go so far as to question whether Heidegger's really a philosopher at all. If you're in a, particularly grouchy mood, you might even call him a charlatan or something like that. Heidegger himself, actually, more often than not, will separate what he is doing from metaphysics, even though he always sees it as relevant to metaphysics and usually as a challenge to metaphysics. So, in ending our discussions of metaphysics in this general survey with Heidegger, we're throwing open the question once again of the very nature of metaphysics itself. What is metaphysics? What makes it a topic, a question, or a theory? Or what makes a topic, a question, or theory into a metaphysical topic, or question, or theory? There's no one better to think about such issues with than Heidegger. If he's difficult, it's ultimately because these issues are difficult ones, at least once you've begun to think about them. Okay. So let's start looking at chapter 1. We'll go through the first 19 pages or so in this translation of chapter 1 and finish it up in the succeeding video. Heidegger starts this work in an interesting way, namely with a question. Why are there any beings at all rather than nothing? Why are there any beings at all rather than nothing? Based on the setup I've just given for Heidegger, we can expect that this question is going to turn out to be strategic for Heidegger. It's intended as a way in to something that metaphysics normally overlooks. Strangely, Heidegger says that this is obviously the first of all questions. It's not the first question historically or in the individual's life, but in the sense that it is the question that is the most basic or fundamental. Heidegger says that this is first in rank. This question is first in rank. What does it mean to ask this question? Why is there anything at all rather than nothing? Why are there beings of all rather than nothing? I've said it. I've just uttered the question. Is that asking the question? And for Heidegger, the answer is no. To really ask this question, to engage in a process of questioning, is more than just mouthing the words. It involves entering into a certain condition of questioning, as we might call it. A certain condition of questioning, a certain attitude towards existence, or a certain existential stance, if you will. And this is accompanied by a certain mood. So he says on the bottom there, and yet we are each, the first page, the bottom of the page, and yet we are each touched once, maybe even now and then, by the concealed power of this question, without properly grasping what is happening to us. In great despair, for example, when all weight tends to dwindle away from things, and the sense of things grows dark, the question looms. Perhaps it strikes only once, like the muffled tolling of a bell that resounds into Dasein and gradually fades away. The question is there in heartfelt joy, for then all things are transformed and surround us as if for the first time, as if it were easier to grasp that they were not, rather than that they are, and are as they are. The question is there in the spell of boredom, when we are equally distant from despair and joy, but when the stubborn ordinariness of beings lays open a wasteland in which it makes no difference to us whether beings are or are not. And then, in a distinctive form, the question resonates once again. Why are there beings at all instead of nothing? Notice here that the question, depending on the mood you're in, almost takes on a different connotation, even a different meaning. Whether you are asking that question, why is there anything rather than nothing, when you're in a deep state of despair or depression, or if you're asking the question, why are these things there rather than nothing, when you're in a state of heartfelt joy? Why me? Why am I so lucky, right? I think there are a bunch of love songs that basically are built on this theme, right? How did I get so lucky as to find you, or whatever, that kind of idea. Why are there any things rather than nothing? And then in a state of boredom, where you feel just the strangeness and the uncanniness of things. Now, Dasein here, which Heidegger mentions in this passage, is Heidegger's term for a particular condition of existence. And this is a famous Heideggerian term. Dasein, which is their being, in German, ordinarily be translated as existence. This is something like the condition that we human beings enter into when, as he says, our being becomes an issue for us. Our being becomes an issue for us. So one definition of Dasein is the being for whom his being is an issue. Dasein is the being for whom his being is an issue. It's this existence that can question its own existence, as occurs when I ask such questions as, who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going? Why is there anything rather than nothing? To ask the question, why is there any being rather than no beings, is an existential stance that belongs uniquely to Dasein, the condition of being that the human being occupies, and that we tend to think of as distinctive of the human versus other animals. So, sometimes you might hear this referred to as Heidegger's term for the human being, but we have to be careful because Dasein here is not something that can be described in terms of a genus species kind of arrangement, or a typology, or an anthropological concept or something like that. Rather, it's this existential condition that we are in insofar as we are able to question our existence. So that's what he's referring to there. Now, Heidegger describes three ways in which the question of being is first in rank. So we can record these here. We'll call this, we need a name for this question. It's described in various ways, but we can just call this the why being question. So you don't have to spell it all out, but the question is, why is there anything rather than nothing? Three ways in which the why being question is first in rank. And the first of these is that it's broadest in scope. So it's broadest in scope because it embraces all that is, past and future as well as present. It includes even the nothing or nothingness because it is nothing. Heidegger says we can never exceed it. And this is a question that asks about the whole, not about particular beings. So just to get a flavor of what he says, let's look at this paragraph on the bottom of 2 extending to the top of page 3. He says, the question is the broadest in scope. It comes to a halt at no being of any kind whatsoever. The question embraces all that is And that means not only what is now present at hand in the broadest sense, but also what has previously been and what will be in the future. The domain of this question is limited only by what simply is not and never is, by nothing. All that is not nothing comes into the question, and in the end, even nothing itself, not as it were because it is something, a being, for after all, we're talking about it, but because it is nothing. The scope of our question is so broad that we can never exceed it. We are not interrogating this being or that being, nor all beings, each in turn. Instead, we are asking from the start about the whole of what is, or as we say for reasons to be discussed later, beings as a whole and as such. So it embraces all that is, past and future as well as present. In a sense, it includes even nothingness because we can speak of it as, it is nothing, when something is nothing. We can never exceed it. We're always surrounded by the thing we're questioning, so to speak. And it's asking about the whole, not about particular beings. So that's why this question is the broadest in scope. Now, the second way in which this why being question is first in rank is that we can never exceed it. Oops. As I just said that, I meant to say it is because it is the deepest. It is the deepest question. Heidegger interprets the why here to mean what is the ground? What is the ground? And this is a pregnant quasi-metaphor, a term that extends the literal sense of that on which we stand, the ground, to a quasi-figurative sense, where ground can mean what something is predicated of or premised upon, right? A person gets arrested and you ask them, on what grounds are you arresting me, right? What's the predicate that leads you to arrest me, or what are you assuming that gives you the justification to arrest me? So ground in that sense too. Heidegger says that to seek the ground is to get to the bottom, or ergründen, the German word, to get to the bottom of something. Literally, this means something like to fathom. To fathom, which of course is a term of depth. If you're measuring the depth, for example, of a body of water, you fathom it. But in this sense, it means to understand something where that understanding is won after a difficult struggle with an enigma or an enigmatic subject matter. The grounding question, so understood, is not necessarily a foundation in the sense of metaphysics, right? So we're seeking the ground. But there's a question about the nature of this ground. And Heidegger will ask, is this ground a foundation, which is the sense that it would have in traditional metaphysics since Descartes, especially, where that would mean a foundation would be something like an indubitable, self-evident, clear and distinct axiom or first principle, which we've seen in our recent series on Spinoza, right? The axioms, which are supposed to be self-evident. Those are foundations in a Cartesian sense. But Heidegger also suggests two other possible interpretations of ground. One would be an abyss that refuses to provide a foundation. Maybe this question leads us to an abyss and not to a foundation at all. And then the third is what he mysteriously calls an unground. What in the world is an unground? An unground. Well, the unground is neither a foundation nor an abyss. But he suggests perhaps a necessary illusion of a foundation. A necessary illusion of a foundation. And that causes one to think of, for example, the transcendental ideas in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which are concepts for which we can never have knowledge, according to Kant, but that are a necessary illusion. We have to assume them in the course of our everyday life. So things like the soul or the mind for Kant is not something that we can have knowledge of or experience of directly, but that we have to assume it. It's a kind of, we're inevitably going to assume it or think that we're aware of ourselves, as Descartes did. Descartes got sucked in by a necessary illusion. So that seems to be what Heidegger's referring to here by the unground, a kind of non-ground that nevertheless presents itself as the illusion of a foundation. I should have said a non-foundation. A non-foundation that presents itself as an illusion of a foundation. The question of being seeks a decision between these three options and asking why. It wants to find the foundation, to find that there's no foundation but only an abyss, or to find this sort of unground situation. It seeks to decide between these three options. And Heidegger contrasts what the question of being, the why question of why being question, is asking for, a decision between these three options, a foundation, an abyss, or an unground. And another way in which you might ask a why question, which is when you're seeking the causes of things. This question does not represent a seeking of causes. A cause implies, or Heidegger implies, I should say, would be of the same kind and level as the beings themselves. And for Heidegger, this would be too superficial a way of answering the question. We can see how such an answer to this question would lead to the question only repeating itself. So let's say you gave the obvious kind of answer that, say, Leibniz would give to the question, why are there beings at all rather nothing? And the answer is, in a conventional way of thinking, God, right? God is the reason that there are beings rather than nothing. But if you view God as a cause and as a being, as a substance, in a Spinozistic, Cartesian, or Leibnizian sense, this would imply that God must be interpreted theologically as just one being among others, and so remains unaccounted for in this kind of an answer. So we can still ask the question, well, why is there God rather than no God? So the kind of answer that this why being question is searching for is a different kind of answer, a decision between finding a foundation, an abyss, or an urground, and not seeking a cause. And that's why it's the deepest. Okay. And then the third way is it's most originary. Most originary. Originary is sort of a Heideggerian term of having the character of an origin, we could say, is what we mean by originary. It's most originary. It's most origin-ish, right? That's what this term is alluding to. Most suitable for being an origin. Why is it most originary? Well, it's not concerned with any particular being, but with beings as a whole, without preferring any particular being. Every being counts as much as every other in this questioning. So, to use Heidegger's example, an elephant in a jungle in India counts as much as a chemical oxidation process on Mars. They're both beings. So every being counts as much as any other. And especially, the human being counts just as much as any other. So that includes that statement that every being counts as much as any other includes the human being. The human being is not privileged in this question. The questioning has a peculiar status. On the one hand, it sets itself back from and over against the whole of beings. It sets itself back from and over against the whole of beings, right? So in questioning, I'm sort of adopting a kind of theoretical position, if you will, for lack of a better term, outside of all being in order to interrogate it and question it. Why is there all this being rather than nothing, right? Where am I standing when I'm asking that question? It sounds like I'm setting myself back from all of being. But of course, I'm not really. because I exist. I'm a being, and so I'm asking about myself too. I can't unambiguously escape the whole of beings. It seems like in some sense I do, but in some sense I don't. I can't literally stand outside this whole. Heidegger addresses this issue at the bottom of page 5. He says, "The why question stands against beings as a whole, so to speak, stands back from them, though never completely. But this is precisely how the questioning gains its distinction. What is asked in this question rebounds upon the questioning itself, for the questioning stands against beings as a whole, but does not, after all, wrest itself free from them. Why the why? What is the ground of this why question itself? A question that presumes to establish the ground of beings as a whole. Is this why, too, just asking about the ground as a foreground, so that it is still always a being that is sought as what does the grounding? Is this first question not the first in rank after all, as measured by the intrinsic rank of the question of being and its transformations?" Heidegger seems to be saying here that the why question of being necessarily puts itself into question as well. Why is it possible, or why is it necessary to ask why is there anything? Why do we think it can be answered? And here we might, as an aside, note that one of Heidegger's great themes is that in philosophy, the form in which a question is posed already tacitly or implicitly anticipates the answer, or at least restricts the scope of possible answers. And in a vulgar way, this is familiar to us from the familiar example of leading questions that contain an implicit premise. Like if I accost you and say, "When did you stop doing drugs?" Right? I'm premising that question on the assumption that you were doing drugs. But in the present case, Heidegger is concerned about the idea of ground that seems to be tacitly premised in the why question. In particular, whether this is assumed to be a being and what notion of being this might be. And here we begin to see that there's a substantial amount of philosophical work that goes into just figuring out what's the appropriate formulation of a question. When Heidegger asked whether the why question might not be first in rank after all, he suggests that we might not have done enough philosophical work yet to find the appropriate question. The search for an answer might take the form, assuming we're really thinking, that is, that we're really committed to subjecting ourselves to the subject matter in our thought. The search for the answer in that case might take the form of seeking out the proper question to ask, the more originary question. Heidegger describes this as the recoil of the question upon itself, in which the asking itself comes into question. This recoil of the question on itself, where instead of just asking, why is there any being rather than no being, I turn towards myself and ask myself, why am I asking this question? Right? This represents for Heidegger a deeply philosophical experience. It represents the philosophical process, and if it's engaged in the right way, it can represent philosophical progress. What we are experiencing here in this recoil is a happening, an event. The questioning becomes transformed in this event into something more originary. It's a profound, you might say, a profound aha moment. But it's more than that. The questioner, it seems, is changed in some deep existential way. Something is opened up. There's a certain authenticity, a certain new distinct possibility of being in a certain way that happens with this recoil. Heidegger calls this a leap. This change, this existential transformation, this authenticity, or whatever you want to say about it, because it's rather obscure when he first introduces it. But he calls this on page 7, quoting him here, he calls it a leap by which human beings leap away from all the previous safety of their Dasein and attain the ground by leaping. So here, if you recall, the Dasein is the sort of condition of putting our own being at issue for ourselves. So we can think of it here asking, what are the usual normal ways in which I consider myself? And in this leap, whatever those usual ways are, I'm leaping away from them. I'm leaping away from the safety of those usual ways of interrogating and questioning reality. But he defers further explanation of the leap at this point, so we will too. But that pertains to this idea of the originary nature of this question. A final way in which the why question is the most originary is that it is a question that's presupposed in all other questions. That is, to really question in any sense is at the same time to ask this why being question. That's what he says. What does he mean by that? Well, perhaps there are many dimensions to this question, but you might think that he means something like this: to ask, for instance, what the earth is, or what a living thing is, or what a painting is, or what music is a way of asking why it exists at all, in the spirit of the authentic why question that Heidegger has been laying out. So this why being question crops up in more particular forms. It crops up when I ask what the earth is. It crops up when I ask what an organism is. It crops up when I ask what a painting is. Those are more specific, particular ways of asking why is there being rather than nothing, because I'm asking why is there this thing, right? Why is there such a thing as painting? You might go through your whole life looking at paintings and never ask yourself, well, why do we have painting at all? Right? That's the way in which this question of why are there beings rather than nothing is the sort of originary question that finds manifestations in all of these other areas of the arts and sciences and areas of dimensions of human life. Heidegger contrasts this truly originary form of questioning, which is the spirit of genuine philosophy, with a pseudo-religious approach to the question, which, and it might not necessarily be, literal religion. I think it could be an ideological approach to a question as well, which is confident that it knows the answer to the question in advance. So the religious form of this would be, the form that it takes when someone is convinced that God is the reason why there are beings and hasn't really thought much further about it. And I call this a pseudo-religious approach because Heidegger, I think Heidegger were too, because Heidegger, to his credit, recognizes that for the genuine person of faith, there is no such confidence that you have an answer to the question. Heidegger says, if such faith, and we might say if such faith, which is pseudo-faith, I would say, if such faith does not continually expose itself to the possibility of unfaith, it is not faith, but a convenience. In other words, clinging to doctrinal answers in order to avoid facing one's doubts or asking basic questions is not authentic faith, but rather it's an avoidance of both authentic faith and authentic questioning. It's a coping mechanism, essentially, for those who can't tolerate the anxiety that goes along with true faith and true questioning. Real faith, and for Heidegger as well, includes doubt within itself. It's an existential commitment to a truth that has been disclosed to the person through faith, but a commitment in the face of doubt. St. Paul famously wrote that the message of the cross was foolishness to those who are perishing. And by the standards of the Hellenistic philosophical culture that he was a part of his milieu, St. Paul recognized that the wisdom he preached, that God had died from the cross and been raised, was regarded from the perspective of what we might today call the secular culture, or that would be anachronistic, but from the perspective of the pagan philosophers of his time, the wisdom that he, St. Paul, preached would be regarded as unwisdom, as the height of foolishness. And Heidegger sort of ironically riffs on this theme and inverts it when he says at the bottom of page 8 that to the person of faith, philosophy is foolishness. He connects this observation with another equally or more even provocative one. The observation that a Christian philosophy is a round square and a misunderstanding. A Christian philosophy is a round square and a misunderstanding. Why? Well, Heidegger admits theology is possible and even evinces here some respect for it. The thoughtful working through of the world of faith, he calls it. And he says that this can even be a great task, so he seems to have some respect for it. So it's not that he's opposed to thoughtful Christians or something like that, or that he believes that Christianity isn't the kind of thing that provides food for thought. For originally Christian faith, philosophy is foolishness because it asks, why is there anything rather than nothing? And this means that it ventures to exhaust what is for the Christian inexhaustible. For the person of faith, as I read what Heidegger is saying here, this is foolishness, attempting to ask this why being question, because we can't get the answers, at least not in the form of knowledge, due to the mystery at the bottom of existence. So the person of faith has a kind of pious respect for the mystery. Piety is respect for the mystery, which is also, for the person of faith, wisdom. It's wise to know your own, know thyself, know your own limitations, to know that the human mind can't comprehend the mystery of why there is anything rather than nothing. By contrast, at least here, Heidegger seems to be taking a page out of Nietzsche's book and casting the philosopher as a kind of Promethean, sacrilegious venturer who wants to fathom depths that, according to the pious person, should not be fathomed. But the philosopher says, I'm going to go forward anyway. I'm going to look behind the veil of Isis, who should be kept modestly veiled. Philosophy, then, by contrast to the pious man, makes the venture. To this contrast between philosophy and religion, Heidegger adds that philosophy always remains untimely. That is, it is out of place. It's not at home in its own time. Page 9, he says, quote, "It always projects far beyond its own time, or else binds its time back to its earlier and inceptive past," unquote. And that second half is what Heidegger will soon see is concerned to do in this book, bind its time back to its earlier and inceptive past. Heidegger doesn't explain here why this is or should be the case. However, it expresses his attitude towards philosophy. Genuine, authentic philosophy can never be respectable. It can never be in fashion, calmly accepted with a yawn by the cultural elites of the society in which it emerges. Anything that puts itself out as being philosophy but is fashionable, is acceptable, is respectable, Heidegger would clearly be suspicious of. As Nietzsche almost said, philosophy is dynamite. It's disruptive. It is, in a Heideggerian term, unsettling, because it doesn't settle comfortably into its time, but rather measures and judges its time. And this implies that philosophy can never truly become professionalized. It's not a profession or vocation or technical expertise. And a corollary of this is that it's not useful. It's not something that we should expect usefulness from. Okay, so that basically covers the initial characterization of this question and its nature. To summarize this one again, 3 ways in which the why question, or the why being question as we've been calling it, is first in rank, namely that it's the broadest, it's the deepest, and it is the most originary. So first discussion question here is, do you agree with Heidegger that why is there anything rather than nothing? Or the exact form here, why are there beings at all instead of nothing? Do you agree with Heidegger that this is the broadest, deepest, and most originary question, and therefore the first among philosophical questions? How important is it that human beings concern themselves with this question? is an interest in this question good, bad, or indifferent? That is, indifferent in the sense of neither good nor bad. Do you believe that there's any hope of finding a satisfactory philosophical answer to this question? Is philosophy, as opposed to, say, religion, theology, or science, best suited to answer this question? So, once again, first discussion question, do you agree with Heidegger that why is there anything rather than nothing is the broadest, deepest, and most originary question, and therefore the first among philosophical questions? How important is it that human beings concern themselves with this question? Is an interest in this question good, bad, or indifferent? Do you believe that there's any hope of finding a satisfactory philosophical answer to this question? Is philosophy best suited to answer this question, or would it be best left to religion, theology, science, or maybe something else? Next, Heidegger deals with what he regards as misinterpretations of philosophy. He launches into a critique of two then current conceptions of philosophy that he regards as misinterpretations of what it's really about. The first of these is the view of philosophy as a foundation of or for culture. And here I think the person he has in mind is Ernst Cassirer. That view is associated with the Neo-Kantian philosopher Ernst Cassirer. There's one of his works, Language and Myth. There he is, old Ernst Cassirer, contemporary of Heidegger. So he had the view that philosophy is a foundation for culture. And the second is the view of philosophy as a maker of worldviews, which is, I don't have a picture of him, but here's one of his works, Philosophy of Existence. Karl Jaspers, who was a fellow existentialist and friend of his. The back there, it says that Heidegger regarded him as the founder of German existentialism. So both of these guys he regards as having the wrong conception of philosophy. First, philosophy is a foundation for culture. On this first view, the task of philosophy is to lay a groundwork for constructing a culture, which is something that this view of philosophy regards as always up to us, to our free exercise of choice and decision. So, for example, if we want to construct a utopian liberal society, it's up to philosophy on this view to provide us with the blueprint for this. And on this view, the task of the ambitious young philosopher is to change the world as working as a kind of engineer or architect of culture. So that's the first view. And Heidegger is more pessimistic about the prospects for doing philosophy in this way, and philosophy being able to accomplish this engineering of culture. This division for him demands too much of philosophy. It demands more than philosophy is capable of providing. Why is this? Well, here he suggests it's because there, to begin with, just too few philosophers. Philosophy is always the domain of a select few, and its effects are only indirect. And this is the key part, I think. They take a long time to germinate. So I can't just decide as a young, say I'm a philosopher in my 30s that I want to change the world. I'm going to lay down a blueprint for my presently existing society to become a utopia by the time I'm, ready to retire or whatever. I think Heidegger would say, if you're a genuine philosopher, your ideas can have an effect, but it's going to be by a very circuitous path that it may take centuries before it actually has its effect. And it will have its effect in a way that you couldn't possibly have foreseen or conceived now. So the idea that you're just going to, as a philosopher, sit down and engineer a new society is a pipe dream. A pipe dream typical of the Enlightenment. The second view, the Jaspers view, philosophy as providing a kind of picture of the world or worldview. On the second view, philosophy, quote Heidegger here, orders the whole of beings into overviews and systems and readies a world picture for our use. One way to think about this is that on this view, the task of philosophy is to generate an ism in the sense of Platonism, Thomism, Cartesianism, Spinozism, Kantianism, naturalism, materialism, positivism, idealism, Marxism, etc., 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 right? On this view, the task of the ambitious young philosopher would be to construct his or her own original system of philosophy, one that could serve to organize all the knowledge that's available at his or her point in history and render a kind of roadmap for relating every area of knowledge and culture to every other. The most ambitious modern example of this would probably be Hegel's philosophy, his encyclopedia. Heidegger sees this as an exercise really in a kind of anti-philosophy, because it's an exercise in simplification, inevitably. Right? If you're going to have a system of everything, you're going to have to simplify things. You're going to have to simplify them to make them digestible, in the sense of, there used to be an old little magazine called Reader's Digest, which would be short versions of longer works. You make them digestible. The problem is, genuine philosophy is supposed to have precisely the opposite effect. It makes things harder. It burdens things rather than alleviating them. Philosophy shouldn't make things simpler, it should make them harder, for Heidegger. And he explains this as a matter of returning weight to things. Right? So think of like lightweight thinking, like newspaper editorial page philosophizing. That's not really philosophizing. It's philosophizing with air quotes around it on the newspaper editorial page. Real philosophizing is returning weight to things, and that means making them difficult. Heidegger sort of implies here that this worldview style of philosophizing is really tacitly nihilistic. It somehow deprives things of their weight by oversimplification to make things digestible. So neither of these, the Cassirer view and the Jaspers view, this is the one that sees philosophy as an architect of culture. This is one that sees philosophy as the constructing of worldviews and systems. They're both wrong-headed and misguided for Heidegger. So what's the right way to think about philosophy? Well, Heidegger replies based upon his view that the why question, why are there beings at all rather than nothing, shows us something about the very nature of philosophy. And it shows us this, that philosophy is essentially a questioning. Philosophy is essentially a questioning. In its questioning, it overlooks ordinary things, the things that we concern ourselves with in everyday life, in favor of something extraordinary, namely being as a whole and being as such. And along with this questioning recoils on itself, as I said earlier. So Heidegger explains this, page 14, looking at the third sentence of the second full paragraph there. This means that this questioning does not lie along our way so that one day we stumble into it blindly or even by mistake, nor does it stand in the familiar order of the everyday so that we could be compelled to it on the ground of some requirements or even regulations. Nor does this questioning lie in the sphere of urgent concern and the satisfaction of dominant needs. The questioning itself is out of order, in the sense of, in a parliamentary setting or in a court of law, you're out of order, right? You're not supposed to be doing this. It's completely voluntary, fully and expressly based on the mysterious ground of freedom, on what we have called the leap. So there we have the leap referred to again, that he again doesn't fully explain yet at this point. In sum, philosophy is the extraordinary questioning about the extraordinary. Philosophy is the extraordinary questioning about the extraordinary for Heidegger. It's not worldview, it's not culture design, but rather the extraordinary questioning about the extraordinary. We might say that the term I've been using to talk about the other two types of philosophy, the term ambitious young philosopher, is actually a misnomer, because the true philosopher does not have ambition in that sense. The true philosopher doesn't seek to do anything with philosophy, whether it's to construct a blueprint of culture or a system of knowledge. Rather, the true philosopher is a sort of brilliant oddball who gets caught up in philosophy and its essential questioning out of his own free choice, as Heidegger makes clear here. But in a way that's sort of spontaneous and that isn't driven by some kind of ulterior motive other than the questioning itself. Okay. So now that we know what philosophy is, let's do some. And this brings us to the topic of Phusis in Heidegger, which is the fundamental Greek word for being as such. And the Greeks we're talking about here are the pre-Socratics. So that's the basic point here, is that Phusis, and we'll talk about how to translate this, is the pre-Socratic word for being. The understanding of philosophy that we just talked about is a vision of the nature of philosophy that Heidegger harvests from his reading of the ancient Greeks, beginning with the originating event of philosophy among those philosophers who are conventionally known as pre-Socratics. Western philosophy was born among those ancient Greek philosophers when they first questioned the nature of beings as such and as a whole. And in ancient Greek philosophy, as I just said, according to Heidegger, the fundamental word for being was Phusis. This is usually translated into English as nature, in German as Natur, both of which derive from the Latin natura. And so that's the standard translation, would be nature. So we get the Latin natura, and then in modern languages, like English and German, we get versions of this Latin word. Natura is the outcome of the original interpretation by Roman philosophical schools of Greek philosophy, where they translated Phusis into their language as natura. At this point, a side note is useful. There's a long tradition in German philosophy dating back to the 1700s of German intellectuals exalting ancient Greek, and sometimes by extension modern German, because of its kinship to ancient Greek, as exalting these languages, especially ancient Greek, as the most profound philosophical language, and downgrading Latin and the Romance languages generally as degenerate, especially French. And Heidegger situates himself squarely in this tradition. In Heidegger's view, the translation of Phusis as natura was a philosophical disaster, because it obscured the profound philosophical insight of the Greeks when they named being as Phusis. The beginning or the inception of philosophy in the West occurred when the Greeks named being as such and as a whole with the name of Phusis. For Heidegger, then, the story of Western metaphysics is a story of gradual decline and degeneration. The greatest moment of Western philosophy was the inception, when the Greeks gave the name Phusis. After that, there was a gradual falling away from what was brought to be at that inception. Thereby, Heidegger hopes to achieve a kind of second inception, another inception, a starting over of Western philosophy by going back and reviving what was done, achieved, seen, named by the pre-Socratics. At the base of this project of Heidegger's is a vision of language. As he says, in a word, in language, things first come to be and are. In language, things first come to be and are. This is why, for him, the idle talk of everyday life or the thoughtless repetition of stock philosophical jargon are such harmful things and philosophical disasters. That's why the replacement of Phusis by natura was so fateful, because it was a philosophical move. It wasn't just an innocent, innocuous translation. So what was it that was captured in the word Phusis? On page 15, Heidegger writes as follows about this topic. He says, this is 4 lines from the bottom. What does the word Phusis say? It says what emerges from itself. What emerges from itself. For example, the emergence, the blossoming of a rose. Right? So you can probably click off to another video, these time lapse where you can see the sped up blossoming of the rose over several days, right? Or however long it takes for a rose to blossom. So pause this video, go find that, and get that in your head. That's what he says Phusis refers to. The emergence from itself, for example, the emergence or the blossoming of a rose. The unfolding that opens itself up. The coming into appearance in such unfolding and holding itself and persisting in appearance. In short, the emerging, abiding sway. That's what Phusis means. The emerging, abiding sway. Alternatively, Heidegger defines it as the emerging and standing out in itself from itself. Emerging and standing out in itself from itself. That's what Phusis is. This pre-Socratic word for being disclosed being as the emerging, abiding sway, or as the emerging and standing out in itself from itself. Heidegger goes on to say that emerging, abiding sway may be observed in processes of nature, such as the rising of the sun, the surging of the sea, the growth of plants, the birth of a human baby. However, Heidegger warns against identifying the Greek philosophical word phusis with any set of natural processes. Rather, it's the word for being as such, first and foremost. It's the word for being as such, not some subset of being. It would be a mistake for Heidegger to surmise that the Greeks extended a concept of nature from empirical observations of nature and then to the philosophy of being itself. Instead, Heidegger says that the pathway of thought actually went the other way. On page 16, beginning in the second full paragraph, he says, "It was not in natural processes that the Greeks first experienced what phusis is, but the other way around, on the basis of a fundamental experience of being in poetry and thought. What they had to call phusis disclosed itself to them. Only on the basis of this disclosure could they then take a look at nature in the narrower sense. Thus, phusis originally means both heaven and earth, both the stone and the plant, both the animal and the human, and human history as the work of humans and gods. And finally, and first of all, it means the gods who themselves stand under destiny." All of that is under phusis. In other words, phusis was a primordial experience of being through which all beings disclosed themselves and emerged into their truth. We might say that phusis was the lens through which beings were brought into focus, but we won't say that because that has subjectivistic connotations that Heidegger would reject. So as a first stab, a comparison to get a handle on this, you might indulge yourself and allow yourself to see this notion of phusis as the lens. But we were better off saying it's the understanding of being that emerged in this period of Greek philosophy. Later on, this meaning of phusis would be narrowed. The notion of phusis, which obviously you can see the kinship with and the etymological connection with our modern notion of physics and the physical. But this notion of phusis that we've just been talking about is submerged and eclipsed if we replace it simply with the notion of the physical as the motions of physical things studied by modern natural sciences. For one thing, if we interpret it in this way, then the ancient Greeks are reduced to primitive scientists and they're not given the credit for their greatness as thinkers that they deserve. The narrowing of the experience of phusis in the direction of the physical though, had already begun, according to Heidegger, in the Greek philosophical world itself. This narrowing of the physical occurred by way of a contrast with the technical, meaning the generating, building, producing, and also by contrasting the physical to the historical. On Heidegger's reading, the original Greek concept of Phusis accompanied both the technical, in the sense of the generating, building, producing, and the historical. And Western thought gradually came to separate out and contrast the physical and the natural, as well as the technical or the artificial and the historical with one another. But originally they were all, according to Heidegger, included in this one sense, before the notion of the physical gradually emerged in the modern sense, which is a kind of falling away from the original sense and meaning of Phusis as the emerging abiding sway. Okay, so this leads us to our second and last discussion question, only two in this one. Second discussion question. How would you compare and contrast the ancient Greek experience of Phusis, as Heidegger describes it, to the empirical encounter with nature that the modern physical scientist is concerned with? What kind of knowledge do each of these types of experience involve? How do each of them relate to the fundamental questioning of being? The why being question. Are both of these equally valid experiences, or does one cancel out the other? So we're thinking of the experience of Phusis that we've just been talking about with the experience, if you will, of the modern scientist, physicist, for example, who is engaging in an experiment and experiencing the world in a scientific way, right? So the question again, second discussion question, how would you compare and contrast the ancient Greek experience of Phusis, as Heidegger describes it, to the empirical counter with nature that the modern physical scientist is concerned with? What kind of knowledge do each of these types of experience involve? And how do each of them relate to the fundamental questioning of being, the why being at all question? Are both of these equally valid experiences, or does one cancel out the other?